Hello, BDO family, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Jade Curtis. I am the executive editor of BlackDoctor.org, also known as BDO. And I'm so glad that you have chosen to join us for this important conversation about the recent and unfortunate devastating wildfires in Los Angeles. Wildfires not only cause destruction to homes and landscapes, but also have a far reaching health implication that many of us just may not even realize. So, joining me today is Dr. Mark Wilson. He is an esteemed expert in exposure science. Dr. Wilson currently serves as the director of exposure science at the Chemical Insights Research Institute. With years of experience studying the intersection of environmental hazards and human health, Dr. Wilson is here to help us unpack how wildfires impact our air, water, and overall well-being. Hi, Dr. Wilson. Thank you for joining us.
Hello. Thank you.
Of course. So this is a critical conversation for everyone. So whether you are in a fire-affected zone or live miles away from the flames, wildfire pollution doesn't stay in one place, and its effects can actually ripple across regions. So please feel free to share your questions in the comments. We will try to get to as many as we can today. Please also let us know where you're tuning in from, whether you're in LA, Chicago, even Atlanta. Please let us know where you're joining us from and where you're taking in this information. So let's go ahead and get started. Actually, before we dive in, Dr. Wilson, again, thank you so much for joining us. We are extremely lucky to have you. Can you please tell us a little bit about the Chemical Insights Research Institute?
Certainly. So thank you for inviting me today to speak with you about issues associated with wildfire and wildland-urban interface fires and how they can impact the environment and ultimately influence human health. So I am a public health scientist. My background is in toxicology and environmental health. And I work for the Chemical Insights Research Institute, which is part of Underwriters Laboratories Research Institutes. We are a nonprofit research institute that focuses very specifically on how chemical exposures impact human health in both positive and negative ways. So we use molecular toxicology, environmental monitoring, analytical chemistry, exposure science in both field and laboratory settings to integrate environmental metrics associated with chemical levels and to understand how those may or may not be acceptable in terms of regulatory compliance as well as health-based criteria. So one of the things that we do frequently is to develop toolkits and guidance documents that are focused on specific health-related issues. And we have recently published a guidance document and toolkit specifically focused on dealing with community level effects from both wildfire and wildland-urban interface fire emissions and residues. So the web link is at the top right of the screen here, and the QR code will also take you directly to those resources. And yeah, so.
Fantastic. Yeah, thank you. Thank you, first of all, for all the work you're doing. And we'll be sure to drop that link in the chat for our audience to easily access. So please feel free to tap the link whether you're in in Los Angeles or have family members there, so that way they can utilize those resources. So let's go ahead and dive in. So we've all seen, the news and how these fires have impacted thousands of homes, and we've now seen that the fires have settled down. But how do wildfires impact air quality, and what are some of those long-term health risks associated with the exposure of wildfire smoke? And I guess I'm asking that question as it currently happened, but also, are there still concerns even now that the fires are gone?
Sure. And those are excellent questions. And one thing I would like to point out is that the fires in urban environments have different emission profiles than traditional wildfires, which are usually in uninhabited areas. So we know a whole lot from a public health and epidemiology point of view associated with biomass fires. And we know a pretty good deal about emission profiles of structural fires in just typical kind of urban fire settings. But when those two things come together, there are a lot of unknowns associated with what the total emission profile is. Nonetheless, in either one of those settings, large-scale combustion events are associated with air quality issues that are visible, right? So we can see smoke plumes, and those smoke plumes are made of smoke particles. And the smoke particles are typically of various sizes. Many of them are clearly small enough to be lofted into the atmosphere. And ones that are of particular concern are the ones that are small enough for us to be able to inhale. So particulate matter and volatile organic chemicals are associated with just combustion in general. When you mix urban fire fuels into the scenario, then we have to really start to understand that all of the constituents associated with the synthetic materials that we use in our daily lives are also now part of that emission stream. So that includes not only particulate matter and volatile chemicals that are associated with burning wood and shrubs and things like that, but also the chemical emission profiles associated with plastics being burned or vehicles being burned. And there are pretty significant issues associated with legacy contaminants, things like lead in paint in older homes that were built pre-1970, asbestos-containing materials in residences that are legacy. They wouldn't be in a new home, but they still exist in homes that have been around for a while. And when those are added to the fire fuel, those contaminants become part of both the airborne emission profile and the hazards that are left in the residues after the fires have ceased.
Oh, wow. So these are things that we have kind of started to push out of the way, but now they're starting to become more of an issue now that they've been released into the air from the fire smokes and things like that.
Correct.
And you also mentioned plastic, and I know microplastics has commonly been a part of a part of our health conversations lately. So is this another way that we have, or people in LA or maybe neighboring regions are starting to experience microplastics in a different way? Or is that something totally different?
That's a very good question. And yes, that would be a way that we would experience microplastics. But typically when we think about microplastics in an environmental health kind of point of view, it is plastics degrading naturally in the environment into smaller and smaller pieces of weathered plastic. And that fundamentally is a different type of mechanism than melting and burning that plastic. Mm-hmm. So the chemical profiles associated with combustion-related microplastics potentially are very different than what we have evaluated as microplastic chemistry in the past.
Gotcha. Okay. Okay. And so, when people think about, wildfires and the smokes that can come from it, we often think it's just polluting the air. But can you explain how wildfires, can also pollute our water sources and what risk could possibly be posed to those neighboring communities?
Certainly. So one of the things, especially with large municipal water systems, like we have in most cities and incorporated areas, is that the pressure in the system keeps the outside world, which can be laden with contaminants, outside of the supply system. So when those systems depressurize, that safeguard is absent. So material can infiltrate from the outside because the pressure is not there to force it out. Mm-hmm. So things like ash and other debris have the potential to infiltrate in during depressurization events, which often occur associated with, power failures and things like that. And that can be a pretty significant problem. There's also a potential for things like volatile chemicals and other organic chemicals to leach out of premise plastic plumbing when it becomes heated. So the elevated temperature can really alter the partitioning of chemical constituents from something that is normally an inert material like high density polyethylene pipe or PVC pipe. And we can have things like styrene and benzene actually coming out of plumbing and winding up in the water.
Mm-hmm. And so I just want to ask, because I'm one of those people who doesn't own a home yet or isn't totally familiar with, piping and things like that. So these are things that are typically safe in the pipes. And now they're starting to come out because of the rise in temperatures, is what you're saying?
That's correct. Yes.
Wow.
It's conditional associated with being exposed to that extreme event.
Wow.
But not the loss of pressure. That's something that is just intrinsic to a water system. Now, I will say that you raise an important point. So if you're a homeowner, you have an opportunity to do things to your plumbing system. Like you can put a backflow preventer on in front of the supply line to your house. If you're a renter, you don't necessarily have the ability to do that. Mm-hmm. So depending on housing situations, there's different levels of intervention and different levels of control that are available to homeowners versus people who are renting and things like that.
Absolutely. And can we actually get into that? I love that you mentioned that there's a filter for homeowners. Is there maybe a filter that, people who are renting can maybe put on their faucets or things like that? Is there something that renters can do to protect themselves?
So there's certainly things like, activated charcoal filters like Brita filters and things like that can be used at point of service. Okay. But a renter doesn't have maybe in an individual domicile, but in an apartment complex setting, a renter doesn't have access to the main feed line for a resident. So it would have to be done at the scale of a complex, and that would be a decision associated with the owner.
Gotcha. And so you mentioned the activated charcoal filter. So maybe, I don't know if you've seen some of those like interesting shower heads that kind of have the charcoal filters in them or that can adjust the pressure or something like that. Is that maybe an option for someone who's renting?
Yes, absolutely.
Okay. Awesome. Well, that's really cool. So sorry about that. So can we talk about maybe some of those chemicals that are released into the air with some of these wildfire smokes? I know there's a lot of concerns about carcinogens. So what are some of those chemicals that are being released in the air from these wildfires?
Sure. So if you could bring up the image, please. So we have a pretty consistent profile of things like benzene and methyl vinyl ketone and formaldehyde and a few other aldehydes that are commonly released with just combustion in general, irrespective of the fuel source that we're talking about. But when, again, urban fire fuels are introduced into the scenario, then we start to see other types of chemical emissions. And this can be things like isocyanates and hydrogen cyanide, which are just chemical asphyxiants. And those are primarily associated with the combustion of nitrogen-containing materials. And they can pose a pretty significant risk to people who have pre-existing hematological conditions like anemia. Because they have trouble trafficking oxygen to begin with. We also see a pretty significant spike in metals emissions associated with urban fire fuels. I actually saw a report in the news today about lead levels spiking, airborne lead levels spiking associated with air quality impacts in California wildfires. And that is primarily due to lead service lines, lead paint, and sealed lead acid batteries that are being included in the fire fuels. So there are also other metals, things like arsenic, which is associated with copper chromate arsenic treated lumber, which was one of the lumber preservatives that was very commonly used up until recently. So many outdoor sheds and decks and things like that contain arsenic as part of a preservative in the wood. And when that wood is burned, that arsenic can be released into the environment. So depending on the chemical state of arsenic, it can either be acutely toxic or it can pose long-term health risks in the terms of being carcinogenic. There are also things like semi-volatile compounds, which are denoted as SVOCs in this picture. And those are things like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are effectively the things that are left in soot when you have incomplete combustion, and PAHs, which is what we refer to them rather than to saying their complete chemical names, are a class of chemicals that are widely known to be carcinogenic. So over long periods of time, there's a potential for increased cancer risk associated with exposure to these types of materials. We also see things like chlorine or chlorinated compounds being emitted. And that is primarily associated with, again, chlorine-containing synthetic materials that are encapsulated in the emissions because they are present in the material that is being combusted. And that's not something that is typically associated with a traditional wildfire, but it very much is associated with when a wildfire meets an urban area.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. And so, and again, I know I kind of mentioned this earlier, but as the fires have now died down, are these things still polluting the air? Is this still something that people in the area should be concerned about? Or do they kind of fizzle as the fire fizzles?
Yeah, so that, again, is a really important question. And when a fire is going, it's dramatic. Mm-hmm. Right? And you can see the plume, and it's very evident that there is something going on and there's a clear environmental impact associated with it. You can often see it, smell it, sometimes taste it. There's absolutely no doubt. But after the fire is out, that dramatic telltale cloud is no longer there. Mm-hmm. But there are residues left behind in the form of settled dusts and ash, as well as liquid effluents that can be very problematic, both from an environmental point of view, as well as from a health risk point of view. So we have to be aware that inhalation is the major route of exposure associated with smoke. And that's, pretty easy to wrap your head around. But inhalation is also something that we have to be aware of as it relates to disturbing material that has been deposited on the ground, which can be, again, lofted up that we can then inhale. But we also need to understand that when it comes in contact with our skin, many of the organic and elemental or metal hazards can partition through our skin, and that route of exposure is important to consider as well. And also, if we are in areas where these residues are present, I don't know if you've ever done yard work for a day and then blown your nose. You have a lot of material that you ingest or inhale in a given day, right? So all of those things remain true even in post-fire environments, but the material that you are likely to ingest or inhale is very different than just, normal run-of-the-mill dirt and ash or dirt and dust, because now it contains ash, and that ash contains many of the chemical and elemental hazards that we have a significant amount of concern associated with.
Absolutely. I love that you brought up that day of yard work, because that's actually something that we can all visualize. I think we've all experienced something like that before. We're noticing, we're blowing our nose and it's a little bit darker than we're used to, or we've got some extra, dirt underneath our nails, even if we did wear gloves.
Right.
So I guess mechanisms for protecting yourself going forward. Do we need to wear masks? Do we need to wear gloves? Like surgical gloves, or what are the mechanisms to protecting ourselves from what's left after the fires?
Sure. Yeah. So tight fitting N95 respirator, like we all got very familiar with over the COVID pandemic, is a very good way to greatly reduce the amount of airborne particles that you may inhale. Gloves, especially disposable gloves, are also an excellent type of thing to use. And just general hygiene, washing hands, washing clothes, doing that rapidly after you have been in that environment for some time is a mitigation strategy that can be employed to really good effect as well.
Good to know. Good to know. And so, are there any specific groups, maybe children or elderly individuals, who are more vulnerable to these effects of, wildfire pollution?
Yeah, absolutely. So children in the world of public health are usually very high on our list of what we consider to be sensitive subpopulations. Right? So they're proportionally smaller than adults, and they do things that adults don't do. So they spend a lot of time closer to the ground, oftentimes, depending on life stage, on the ground. They exhibit a lot of hand-to-mouth behavior that most of us grow out of early on. And those types of things really can increase their risk of both exposure and, due to their small body sizes, proportionally larger, what we call doses. Right. So if you think about a adult who might weigh 70 kilograms ingesting 10 milligrams of something, that dose is distributed as 10 milligrams divided by 70 kilos. But if it's a small child that weighs between, 5 to 12 kilograms, that denominator is much smaller. So the relative dose is actually much higher. And when we're thinking about things like carcinogens, it's important to recognize that cancer is typically a disease that has a very long latency period associated with it. So if you are exposed at a younger time, that clock can start ticking earlier. So that's something to be, aware of as well. Another group of people that we have a significant amount of concern with is pregnant women and women of childbearing age. And that is particularly true to being exposed to things that are known to be either developmental toxins or to be associated with adverse pregnancy outcomes. So things like lead are very well established as problematic for very young children. And that is one of the things that has been associated with increased levels in both airborne emissions and residues associated with these fires. And elderly people and people who have pre-existing conditions, particularly respiratory and cardiovascular conditions, also are at increased risk of pretty significant negative health outcomes, just due to exacerbation of those underlying conditions. The same is true for people who have things like chronic obstructive pulmonary disease or asthma. The added stress associated with fire-related exposures, on top of like psychological stress, which is also a significant contributor to negative health outcomes, is something that really needs to be considered.
Yeah, you talked about the psychological stress. So that's really interesting because obviously, if you're it, if you've been impacted by the wildfires, whether you actually lost your home or maybe it was a neighboring community, could those psychological stressors or triggers actually kind of cause you to have worse outcomes with some of these things that you're coming in contact with?
Yes, absolutely. So there have been lots and lots of studies done on how stress modulates the immune response.
Mm.
So it can increase stress levels, can dampen your ability to fight off infection. And I just think, generally speaking, I know when I'm stressed out, I don't enjoy much of anything. And yeah, so it's a big part of the exposure profile that are associated with a post-disaster type of scenario, that oftentimes is kind of segregated away from a chemical stressor.
Mm-hmm.
But the reality of it is that inside our bodies, stress creates endogenous chemicals like stress hormones and things like that that have very real physiological consequences that can interact in ways that are surprising with other types of exogenous chemical exposures.
Absolutely. And so, I know we mentioned about, those really vulnerable groups. We talked about some of those impacts with, some of the people who are a little more obviously vulnerable. And I think when we're thinking about those wildfires, we think of, it happened in LA. So the people who are in LA are the only ones who need to be concerned. But how do these pollutants impact, neighboring communities or even those who may not be neighboring, kind of maybe a little bit further? Can those pollutants impact, communities that aren't as close or nearby or outside of LA?
Yeah. So one of the things that is good to point out is this is a figure that is associated with the Fire Now website from the U.S. Geological Service. And it's showing the impact in the continental United States of Canadian wildfires. And you can see that the yellow is air quality index. And you can see fire-related impacts in air quality in the southeastern United States from a combustion source that's originating in northern Canada. So you can have very localized types of effects where, as you said, if the fire is in LA, then the people in LA or very close are going to be exposed just due to proximity. But there's also regional effects as well as very large scale kind of continental effects that can be associated with exposure to the emissions. And one thing that is really important to recognize associated with this is that as wildfire and wildland urban interface fire emissions are released into the atmosphere and transit for vast distances, that there's a lot of opportunity for additional chemistry to occur in the air, whether it's being activated by sunlight or interacting with other chemicals like ozone in the atmosphere, that can lead to a very different type of exposure profile at a distant site relative to what it might be very close to the sources of combustion itself. Mm-hmm. That said, one of the biggest types of pollutant exposures that is known to be associated with adverse health outcomes at long distances is particulate matter. And the air quality indices that EPA produces that you typically see on the evening news and tells you whether or not the air quality is good or bad or unhealthy or whatever, is actually a really good indicator to let you know what types of influences a distant event may be happening on your air quality at any given point in time. Because one of the things that the air quality index encapsulates is PM 2.5, which is particulate matter that is 2.5 microns or smaller, which is the stuff that we worry about in the public health sciences because it's readily inhaled and can get way down into the lower regions of our respiratory system, where it's difficult to clear and can also partition directly into our circulatory system. So people can experience adverse cardiorespiratory outcomes associated with particulate matter exposure that originates from thousands of miles away. And it is a significant issue.
Absolutely. And can we pause really quick to really take in what we're looking at here? And if I'm wrong, please correct me. So in this upper left hand corner where this small red dot is, are you saying this is where the fire was and then it traveled down to where these other red dots are, and that's where
so the red dots on the map represent air quality monitoring stations. And the kind of gray cloud areas are smoke plumes. And here there were actually two fires, one in Western Canada where that red dot is, and one kind of in central to Eastern Canada. And the prevailing wind conditions were pushing the Western smoke plume up towards Alaska. And you don't see a lot of impacts on air quality in the Pacific Northwest or the Western US, whereas the one in the kind of central region, the prevailing winds were pushing down, and you do see very significant impacts. And one thing that is really important to think about when we're thinking about the potential for public health outcomes here is that there are a whole lot more people in the central and northeastern portion of the US than there are in northern Canada and Alaska. So just depending on weather conditions and the demographics of the areas that are actually being impacted, you can have very, very different outcomes related to population health. And just by virtue of having more people in these areas, you have a higher probability of more sensitive subpopulations in those areas. So more children, more pregnant women, more people with pre-existing conditions. And all of those things can be, kind of part of the mix associated with the health impacts of these events.
Definitely. So, wow. So even if you aren't in the affected area, you can still be affected by, weather and traveling smoke that can cause harmful air in your area. And so that leads me to ask, because we've talked about some of the preventative measures or the protective measures you can take if you are in that area. But what can you do, whether it's indoor safety or outdoor safety? Again, is it masks? Is it gloves? Are there things we need to do within our homes to kind of save or preserve our air and make our air healthier? What are some of the things that we can do to protect ourselves both in and outside of those communities?
Sure. Yeah. So one of the things that you can do proactively in an outdoor setting is to pay attention to air quality indices. And if they're indicated to be unhealthy, to not engage in outdoor activities, right? So if you normally go and jog and the air quality is forecast to be unhealthy, you can make the decision to put that off until air quality metrics have improved. Sometimes that is not a practical advice. And this is true in particular for people who work outdoors. Oftentimes they don't have the ability to just go, well, I'm not going to go to work because one, they may lose their job, and two, they probably need to go to work so that they can pay their bills. So proactively monitoring outdoor air quality is something that you can do. And also, if there are forecasted or identified impacts, then wearing appropriate clothing, wearing a tight-fitting N95 mask, and maintaining good hygiene and using as much disposable type of clothing as possible is one way to mitigate those problems.
Absolutely. And I've noticed you keep mentioning the N95 particularly. So I know, during COVID, we were just kind of grabbing those blue ones and throwing those on. So those, do you not recommend those? Are they not as safe? Or are N95 just kind of the best of the best? And if you don't have access to those, will the blue ones suffice? Or what are your thoughts there?
I think that realistically, even a bandana is better than nothing.
Okay.
But given the choice, if you have access to N95s, they're better than like a bandana, and a surgical mask is better than a bandana. So it's just kind of stepwise associated with the level of protection.
Absolutely.
N95s are evaluated, that 95 means they stop 95% of particles that are 2.5 microns and smaller. So they're specifically evaluated for dealing with particle hazards.
Yeah.
Whereas surgical masks are primarily trying to keep infectious material from you going out. But either, anything is better than nothing.
Absolutely. Anything better than nothing. That's our going to be our tagline for the day. Noted also, as I never knew that the 95 meant it stops 95% of particles. That's wow. I never knew that. Mm-hmm. Awesome. And so we also mentioned about water quality, and this is, I know we're running down on time. I know I've held you a little bit longer, but I just want to ask one last question. We mentioned about water quality. Are there things that we can do to kind of test our water quality within our homes or our apartments to see if it's safe to drink? Or obviously I know that we could kind of look at it and see if it's the wrong color, but are there things that we can do to test the water quality?
So you should be able to get a water testing report from a municipal water distribution system that includes evaluation of chemicals. But one thing that, or actually several things that you can do, is to use your eyes and use your nose. And if things look or smell strange, then trust that as an indicator that something is amiss. There are no specific criteria or regulations associated with water testing in individual homes. That is usually something that is left up to homeowners to do. But there are, if you have resources available, there are contract laboratories that can, you can send a water sample into, and they can provide that information for you.
Fantastic. Well, I want to thank you so much, Dr. Wilson, for your time. If you have any final thoughts, please feel free to share. What do you think? Are there any last final thoughts that those affected communities or neighboring communities need to know?
Sure. One of the things that we didn't touch on is the indoor air quality issues associated with mitigating smoke and ash risk. So one of the things that you can do is, if you have a HVAC system, you can upgrade the filtration in the HVAC system to a minimum of a MERV 13 air filter, which will greatly increase the efficiency of particle capture. And also, don't open doors and windows. Try to maintain as tight a building envelope as possible during a smoke event, and only run HVAC systems in recirculation mode so that you're not bringing in contaminated outside air. You can also augment HVAC filtration with portable air cleaners. And you can use portable air cleaners even if you don't have HVAC systems in place. And they're commercially available off-the-shelf air cleaners that have filters associated with them. Usually they provide HEPA level filtration, which is very, very effective at removing particles from the air. But they are expensive devices. And when you're capturing particles, you are concentrating them on a filter. So that can actually represent a source of exposure over time. So another thing that can be accomplished is to create a do-it-yourself air filter out of a box fan and a appropriately sized HVAC filter that can be duct taped to the back of it. And this can be effectively thought of as a kind of disposable air cleaning device. So instead of spending hundreds of dollars on a portable air cleaner that may pose an exposure risk down the road, you can construct these from materials that are readily available at any hardware store or big box store very rapidly, and then simply get rid of it when the need for it has gone away. And we actually have resources about constructing these devices as well as evaluating them for electrical and fire safety that are included in our toolkit.
Man, yeah, that's fantastic, actually. So per room, would you need one of these per room? Like if you're in a a 3-bedroom home, would you need one per room, or I guess how many rooms would this cover?
So yeah, it would be one room at a time,
Okay.
and one direction to take is to establish a clean room and to only have one device running and to try to tightly seal that room,
Okay.
or to place multiple devices throughout a home.
That is fantastic. If you are viewing, please feel free to check out all of these resources. He has dropped some gems today. And we will be sure to link these on the BDO platform as well. If we have permission, we're going to ask Dr. Wilson after this if we can link these on the BDO website as well for easy access.
Please do.
Yes, fantastic. Just for easy access, because he's touched on a lot, but I'm sure there is a whole lot more in here that could help improve the air quality in your home and help protect yourself, whether you're in that community or outside of the community. So again, Dr. Wilson, I want to thank you so, so much. You have shared so much incredible knowledge and information for our community that I'm sure will help improve the lives of many. For those of you watching, please feel free to share this live, get this information to those who are in LA and neighboring communities, or even not so close, just because it can help you in the future. If anything, unfortunately, happens, God forbid, happens to you in the near future. So again, Dr. Wilson, thank you so, so much. And to our audience, thank you so much for joining us. We hope to see you soon.
Thank you.